Hello everybody, this is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to handle your HTML image tags like a pro. If you look at the W3 spec, it's quite easy, right? I have an image tag, I have a source attribute, and I might have an alt description. And I could specify the width and the height if I choose to. So what's there to handle about an image tag? It's the easiest tag in the HTML specification. Of course it works, and there's nothing more to say about it, right? Probably 95% of all websites out there will use it like that. So what more is there about it? Well, loads actually. When I surf to a website, I always want to have a slick experience and the fastest possible response, as well as a functionally usable website. Modern day websites aren't just text and styling. Most of them have fancy images as well, from logos to banners to bigger images. So when you choose the image you want to put on your website, it makes a big impact in the performance of your website. Once you have taken yourself by camera that image that you want to use, or you have selected an image from another source, or you have received some image, the next question that always arises is, what format will I use it in? Will I save it as a JPEG, or as a GIF, or as a PNG, as a GIF, or as a WebP, etc. And so the first choice is to manage your image, to save it in the right format. One size fits all, right? Well, not really. Sometimes you need a PNG for a transparent background. Sometimes you need GIF for its animation, etc. So the trade-off is to choose between a good enough quality and the size of the image. You might also need to resize the image for it to fit in the location where you want to use it. If my good-looking image takes 100K in size versus 10K, on a desktop with a fast internet connection, nobody will notice. But on a tablet or on a mobile phone, that might be already a completely different story. These days, we think that everybody has 5G or fiber all the time. But then you have a bad reception because of a concrete wall, or you're in a more remote location. Well, then that speed might drop quite fast. If we look at the latest browsing statistics, 62% of internet traffic is mobile, while only 36% is desktop. And we have between 1 and 2% which are tablets. However, tablet stats aren't correctly, as I discovered later on, because most of them pretend to be just mobile phones. These days, a lot of sites are designed with the mobile-first approach. So in the end, performance is key, right? There are enough tools out there to test the performance of your website and the response times, as well as the total size your page takes when loading. If you have a website like mine that receives about a gazillion requests per 1,000 years, that doesn't really matter, right? If you're the Googles or the Microsofts or the Amazons of this world, on one side, you care less because you have a leased line which already has a fixed cost associated to it. While if you're a smaller player with still some volume, ingress and egress is very important and comes at a cost. Then again, the Googles, the Microsofts and the Amazons, even though their bandwidth cost is fixed, there's still a limit to the amount of traffic they can handle at the same time. Even though internet connections went from 1 GB to 400 GB, you still need a multitude of servers behind it to service those requests. If on my website I have 10 images between 2K and 10K, or have 10 images which each take up 100K, that's a factor 10 in difference in bandwidth, and since it takes more time, I will need more servers to service this website. Of course, modern sites, from Amazon for instance, isn't just one server. First, you have the regional domains. Then, you have a multitude of IPs. You might have some resilient load balancing behind them, and you might still have some part of the services which are divided in subdomains, for instance to serve scripts, images, CSS, etc. So in the end, for big players, managing their images on their homepage isn't even more important as for medium players. And now in this game, the first step is to choose the right image format and to make compromise between good enough quality and the size of the image. But that's just for one site. The next step in which we'll dig in today is how to handle multiple images for multiple clients. You have your mobile users, you have your tablet users, and you have your desktop users. And for mobile users, you will have to resize your images to have a max size of 400 pixels. For tablet users, the maximum is 768 pixels, while for desktop images, you might go over 900 pixels. Even though we have CSS frameworks like Foundation Zerb and Bootstrap, somehow we still need to manage those different versions of the images correctly ourselves. So in this video, I'll have a first look at my basic setup, which I made for playing around with the possibilities. Then I'll have a look at my client-only solutions. Then I'll have a look at my server-only solutions. And finally, I'll make a mixture of both. So let's dig in. So in order to showcase the different possibilities, I have created a little ASP.NET MVC project. Here you see the landing page. Under there, I have created a subpage for each possible scenario which I could imagine. We will discuss them later in detail. For this, I have used an ASP.NET project. However, for the pure client-side HTML, I don't need that, and everybody can use it just by creating a standard HTML page, which you can host wherever. Now let's dig into Visual Studio. As you can first see, under the www root directory, I have an images directory. Under there, I have created 4 subdirectories: the desktop, the mobile, and the tablet. In your project, you will have the same image in different sizes. Here, for clarity, I chose to have a distinct different image for each of the versions, so that when we switch over from one version to another, we can clearly distinguish what's the image. The 4th directory is the image type directory, wherein I have one image of different types, which we'll show later. Next off, we have our classic controller, we have our home controller, and each for the sample page, we have an action. Associated with that, of course, we have under the view home directory a CHTML page, whereon I put the logic for each of the samples I will show. Then I have a basic view model, which just handles my title. And I have a home view model, which inherits from the basic, but which doesn't do anything. There is also a middleware, which we'll discuss later. And then there's a number of image controllers, which we also will discuss later. So all in all, this is a very basic setup. Since we are going to discuss and play around with the differences between a desktop view, a mobile view, and a tablet view, I have also an Android version running, which allows me to really simulate the effect on a tablet. Even though by resizing our browser we can have some result, in the end it's not the same thing. So I have a tablet version and I have a phone version. And this concludes my basic setup. So now let's have a look at the different image types. Well, just a subset. So I originally started with a JPEG image, which was 4K. Then I converted it to a PNG, which went to 45K. I converted it to a GIF, which went to 17K. I converted it to a hike, which went to 13K. I reconverted it to GIF, which stays more or less the same as the JPEG. And I converted it to WebP, and it became 8K. So as you can see, even though it's the same image, in the end, depending on the type you choose, an image might just multiply times X in size. So I'm far from being an expert between what each of those image types really does. I know there's a difference between lossy and lossless images, and I'm sure there's a lot of videos who explain much better in detail whether or not you should take the lossy or the lossless image. However, I do see the differences in size when I save an image and what is worth it for me or not. So a quick overview. A JPEG is optimized for minimum file size with acceptable quality loss. A GIF was the original image from a long time ago, which is also quite limited in the number of colors. However, GIF still easily allows animations. PNG allows lossless, allows transparency, and is quite often used for that, is quite sharp and detailed, but it will always be larger because it keeps all data. WebP is a good modern alternative, and it offers both lossy and lossless images. In general, performance-wise, it's better than JPEG. and so more and more modern sites are using WebP. Hike is a new modern alternative, however my browser was not supporting it. And finally, gfif is more or less the same as JPEG, except that it's a form of container. So as you can see, depending on the image you have, choosing the right format makes a huge difference on how much size that image takes and the loading time when a client wants to see your image. So choose wisely. Sometimes you need maximum capacity and you need maximum resolution and you don't want to lose anything. But in most situations, I think that compressing, sizing down is a good alternative choosing between the size of the image and the quality of the image. So now let's dig into the HTML only version of things. For this, even though I used ASP.NET MVC, this can be done in any browser on any HTML page. So first look at our initial page. I've created a page whereon I display 3 different types of image. My large image, my medium size image, and my small size image. Let's look at it on my phone. As you can see, the large image is way too large. Even the medium image doesn't really fit, and the small does. Now let's look at the tablet. It's still way too large. The medium fits, and the small is too small. So this is the playing field we'll be working with. So we can clearly see when we switch from a large to a medium to a small, by having a different image, we clearly see we switch over. So if we look at the basic HTML, it's very easy. First we have our large image, then we have our tablet medium image, and then we have our small mobile image. So how could we try to tackle that? Well, it's easy, right? We're using Bootstrap. So let's try to hide the image using Bootstrap. Very easy. I have my first, which is only available for my desktop. I have my second, which is only available for my tablet. And my third, which is only shown on mobile. So let's test it out. Okay, seems to be working. I only have my large. Let's resize. I only have my medium. Let's make it smaller. I only have my small. Let's try the Android simulator. Well, I only have my medium on my tablet. Very good. And on my phone, I only have my small. So what's the fuss about it? Well, after the first couple of lines, I've already fixed the problem. There's no need to continue, right? Or is there? Actually, there is. If we open up our debug console and we look at everything which happens, I'll just filter here on images. What do we have here? Okay, first I have my logo, but then it loads my large image, but it also loads the medium image, and it also loads the small image. So on a tablet, instead of only showing the medium, it also loads the large and the small. And on a phone, it's the same thing. It will load the small, but it will also load the big one and the medium one. And that's not something we want, of course. So this basically means already that this is not a viable solution. Okay, next. What's possible next? So next, we're going to replace our image with a picture. A picture is another kind of tag which allows us to specify different images in the same location, and depending on our media queries, use the first, the second, or the third, or even more depending on the sizes you want to play. You could also add more images if you want to go vertically and show different images, etc. So in our scenario, this looks like this. For the desktop, I have a minimum width of 992 pixels. For a tablet, I have a minimum width of 768 pixels. And then for everything else, I just display the mobile version. So what does it give? I have the large. If I size down, I have the medium. If I size down more, I have a small. Now let's look at our debug window. And as we can see, I'm in large. It only loaded large. If I resize, it will load another one, which is normal. We switch to medium, and at that time it loaded medium. If I resize more, it loaded the small. Now if I stay on this resolution and I refresh the page, it only loads my small. If I go to medium resolution and I reload the page, it only reloads the medium image. So this seems like a quite good candidate to solve our problem. Now let's look in Android. The small version is working. If we look at the tablet, our small version is working. So in essence, we fixed our issue, right? Well, yes and no. Technically, I started out with the image tag, and now I've already switched to the picture tag. So what are the pros and cons of both? Every browser supports the image tag. You only have one line of code. It works out of the box. However, as we've seen before, having different formats isn't that easy. What are the pros of picture tag? Well, you have much more flexibility. It supports media queries, and we have some fallback support. What are the cons? Well, you need to define 3 different lines for each image. There used to be a time that the picture tag was not that supported. I think nowadays all modern browsers do support it. Picture tag even allows to put in different formats with a sort of fallback. If the first one is not supported, the browser will choose the next one, etc. Now let's dig in deeper and look at the next sample. Not using picture tag, but still staying on image. So the next version is what we call data attributes. In essence, we are working again with an image. However, as you can see, the image doesn't have a source element anymore. It's empty at load time. And we added some data elements. We have data desktop, we have data mobile, and we have data tablet. And in essence, we're using the trick which the previous picture tag was using, and we're including for image all different versions. And then we have a script that at load time will determine the size of your browser image and will, depending on that size, choose your data attribute and fill in the source element. So let's have a look. So we do have an image filled in. It might be a little bit slower. However, if we resize, since the image was filled in on scripting, nothing happens. I haven't completed this one. I did complete one further down the road, and in the end, next to having this normal script, I could also detect whether or not the size changes and then re-update it, but were it based on scripting. Now let's see how this behaves on Android. Well, technically we can't really resize, so for a tablet or a mobile that might be less of an issue, but for my tablet it loads the right image. If I go to my mobile, it loads the right image. So this seems to be working, but we do require scripting in order to complete this step. And some browsers might still configure themselves as not to allow scripting. If we disable scripting, we simply won't have an image. Also, an issue with this one is that you still have a lot of search engines which try to take a first picture of your website and don't necessarily execute scripting, which means that if they would take an image of your website, all your images in that image taken would not be present. And so you might have a completely deformed website. So think carefully about this option, whether or not this is a viable option. The next version is called srcset attributes. And so here we have an image. We have a source image, which is our desktop version. And then we have a srcset, which is like a form of media query, where we do specify again sizes. And depending on different sizes, we switch from desktop to mobile to tablet. So let's have a look. So we have our desktop and we have nothing else. If we resize the browser, we switch to tablet and then we switch to mobile. Now let's try this out on Android. What do we have here? Well, it loads the large image. And as you can see, at first load, that's quite slow. It ignores the medium and the small image. So for mobile and tablets on Android, that doesn't really seem like an option. Let's look at the tablet version, same problem. It's loading the large image and nothing else. So even though this might have seemed a viable option, After looking around through some AIs, in the end, most of them said to ignore the source set and to switch to picture images if we really wanted to have the effect that we have. So this more or less concludes the basic possibilities when you only have HTML. Since I don't have an Apple phone and there's not really an Apple emulator available, I can't really test it, but I suppose that it will be comparable to what is happening on an Android tablet and or phone. So now let's look at the server version. We are developers, right? We like to tweak around. Of course, we can do better than what Microsoft was doing, can't we? Well, yes and no. It's not necessarily about if we can do it better or not, but it's rather about whether we have more control or not. If you just have a normal website where you hard-code everything and you display your images, doing it server-side isn't really needed. However, if you're making your own blog and each blog article is saved in a database and the images associated with that are also saved in a database, then this is the route to go, because then you will have an image handler who will call your database to first of all retrieve your images and then show them. I'll do a separate video on that. Now, having a blog site is one possibility, but that might also be something else. You might be creating your new latest real estate website, wherein on one side the client uploaded one image, and then on the other side you either have a dynamic processing unit who, depending on which client connects, automatically compresses and or resizes that image, or you might have a pre-processing to save yourself those images to a database and then show the right version. Also, you might be in a scenario where the downside image is free, but if you want to download the high resolution image, you need to be authenticated. Again, here you can only do that with a custom handler. So the options are limitless. It's all about your imagination. So if you look at this HTML, well, it's quite easy. I have image, I have source, and I have my URL. The only difference is I'm not going to the image directory anymore, but I'm going to a responsive image. And so next to that, I created my first image controller. So let's have a look in there. And here I just have my route and the image name he takes from the get. And here is very simple logic. I take the user agent, and based on the user agent, I try to determine whether or not my browser is a mobile browser, is a tablet, or is a desktop. So if I don't find anything, by default, I return a desktop. Otherwise, I try to fine-tune. And then based on predefined convention, well, my device type concurs with what I initially did in my www root directory. Under the images, I have desktop, I have mobile, and I have tablet. But of course, you can structure that the way you want, because it's code and you're free to do so. If the image doesn't exist, well, I just return not found. And if not, based on the image type, I return the right header and I return the image. So let's have a look. I call my first server image and I get my desktop version. If we switch to Android, let's first try out the phone and I get my small image. Now let's have a look at the tablet. Oops, in here it doesn't really seem to work. I still get my large image. So why is that? Let's look at the code. So when I refresh, in my user agent, I do receive its Android, I do receive its Chrome, but at no point do I have a notion of mobile. So this simple solution, even though it works, currently I have no notion of mobile. We'll try to tackle that in the next sample. And there's another issue. When I come in with my normal browser and I resize, nothing is happening. So why is that? Let's look at the code. First of all, in the image, we just specify responsive image. Nothing else, nothing more, nothing less. If we look at the image controller, based on the user agent, we will receive a mobile or a tablet or a desktop version. And since it identifies our browser as a desktop version, at no point will there be any resize. So technically we tackled loading an image server-side, but there are loads of complications in order to achieve what we want to achieve. So I made a second version, responsive image v2. I created a second controller, and the trick I did here is that if in my user agent I find a tablet or I find Android and not the previous one which is mobile, I'll return the tablet. Now, will this work? Well, yes and no. I have no clue about how many different browsers exist on different kind of tablets. And so that means that you will have to tweak yourself each and every user agent potentially. And even though you have added, I don't know, whatever today, tomorrow a new browser might just tweak it, and for your tablets it might not work anymore. So it's kind of tricky. It does a little bit better, but it's not there yet. So let's again try it out in the browser. On the browser we have a large image. If we resize, nothing has changed, of course. Now let's look at Android, first on a tablet. And of course now it works. If we go back to the mobile phone, it still works. If we retest the code, our user agent is still the same. Well, it does not contain tablet, but it does contain Android, and it's not mobile. And so we switch in here. So it's a little bit better, but we're still not there yet. So in order to try to make it better, I made a third version, which I've called advanced, but in the end, it's not so advanced. So next off, I did some Google search, and I came to a component, one canine detection, which promise you heaven. And depending on what comes in, they try to determine your device, the browser, the platform, and the engine. In order to implement that, I needed to add detection to my services, and then use detection. And I also needed to enable the add session, which I did. I created a new controller, which I called advanced controller. In here, I receive my detection service. And based on that, I try to determine whether or not it works. So if we go back to our Android device, let's have a call. And when we come in here, we did have a mobile identification, but that was working before as well. So that is still working. Now if I go to our tablet, here again, it just goes to desktop. And so even the advanced component doesn't really seem like a solution. So as an alternative, afterwards, what is proposed is to add some kind of extra client-side scripting in order to resolve this. So this concludes the pure server-side handling. We are still not able to detect correctly which device is coming in, and if we need to resize, we can't really do that. So since our server-only approach is having two issues, on one side client resize are not working, on the other side, even though we have the user agent, we can't always determine whether or not we have a tablet. So in comes the first attempt at a mixed mode. So what have I changed? Well, I have an image. I have no source element anymore. I have a class which will be used to identify those types of images. And I have a data name, which is more or less the same thing as the data attribute we were using before. And I have some client-side scripting. The first thing it does is try to determine the size. And based on the size of your screen, it will transmit whether or not it's mobile, tablet, or desktop. And then once it has that information, it searches for the responsive image class, and it fills in the source image, where we still call the server-side responsive image, this time v3, still with the image name, which is in data name, and it adds a size element. If we look at the image controller v3, next to our image, we also have a query parameter, which is of size. If we do receive an extra query parameter, we will use that as type. If we don't, we still fall back on the normal user agent. And the rest is the same. Now if we go back to the browser, for normal size it works. So if I look at my normal image, it's working. I get the big image. There's still no resize. If I make it smaller and I refresh, I get my tablet image. If I make it smaller and I refresh, I get my mobile image. Now let's look at Android. If I look at my mobile phone, I still get my mobile phone image. I get a tablet image. So there's progress. If we debug by using a tablet, what do we receive? Well, receive a size of tablet, and then it continues. Now I made a second version where I kicked out the script, or suppose the script is disabled, to see that my v3 controller is still working. So if I go to my normal browser, there's no script anymore. Since it's desktop, I get my big image. Even if I make it smaller, it'll stay desktop all the way. If I look at the code, well, my size element is nothing. and so it falls back. And I still have the tweak for my tablet. If I go to Android, tablet only, even though there's no script anymore, there's a fallback, and it shows it correctly. Now, if we want to play safe and combine both, we can also do this scenario. We have the normal scenario where we have the responsive image, which is replaced by script, and we have the no script fallback, which is a combination actually of the first two scenarios. In the first scenario, we had an image with a class. In the second scenario, we have the image hard-coded. Well, in this, we had a combination of both. If we allow scripting, it will fill it in. If we don't allow scripting, it will fall back based on what we have defined. In the fourth scenario, I try to combine the previous scenario with responsiveness. And so now my script listener is not just filling in the window size at startup, but when the image gets resized, it's retaken and the source image is remodified if needed. So let's have a look. So I have my large image. If I resize, I get my medium image. If I resize again, I get my small image. There's a little bit of a lag, but it works. On an Android tablet or phone, that's not really an issue. It still works. And so this way we try to combine best of both worlds. Now in our next scenario, I went back to picture, the original one which was working quite well. And so here, there's no script anymore. As you can see, I have my media queries, I have my responsive v3, and I pre-hard code at the end the size, desktop, tablet and mobile. So let's see how that behaves. I have my large. I resize. And as you can clearly see, the responsiveness is better than if we just run a script. Let's look on Android. The small image is working. Let's look on the tablet. And the tablet image is working. Now I've created a final scenario, which is based on cookies instead of on transmitting the size as a parameter. This scenario is much more specific and won't work all the time. If you want to use cookies, you need to have first a request coming in to place the cookie, and only the second request can use the cookie. In some scenarios where you're on a dating site or on a real estate site, you're first on a search page. And so there you can determine the size of the browser, and then if the user clicks through to the image he wants to see, or to the page which contains the image, you have already established the size of the image. The downside of this scenario is that there's no way to handle possible resizes. So again, it's a possibility, it depends. And so as you can see in the code here, it's more or less the same, except that it's no parameter that's being added. It just adds the parameter. I've created a controller v4. The good side about this is that your image will always work. Even if there's no scripting, it will display your default image. And based on the backend logic, there's a fallback scenario where you have the user agent with the Android tweak. So it's possible. So let's run this. So first, when we run it as a big one, there's no difference. Now let's resize and rerun it. We should have a tablet version. Let's refresh. We still have the normal one. So if we switch over the code, it retrieves a cookie. And as you can see now, our cookie is tablet. If you go back to browser, now we have our tablet. Again, if we resize, it'll stay tablet. If you make it very small, and refresh again, and we need to refresh a second time. So as you can see, well, I didn't implement the more complex scenario, but you first need to implement your landing page and then your second page. Also, like real estate sites, in general, people can go directly to the real estate which is presented next to the search page, and even there you might have an issue. So it's a possibility, but it really depends. So the final sample is the responsive image middleware. For demo purposes, it was much easier for me to use an image controller and tweak everything in there. If you're serious with this scenario and using backend, you would rather use a middleware. That also allows you to extend it to a shared component to be able to be tested more easily, etc. So in essence, it's more or less the same. The only difference is that instead of having an attribute, here you need to look at your request path and depending on that, determine whether or not your middleware needs to do something. The rest of the logic is exactly the same. I reverted back to my query string and there's nothing much which really changes. We do need some plumbing. If you go to the programs, well, we need to add the middleware and then we need to call explicitly middleware. Let's have a quick test. And it works exactly the same thing. I am not going into detail here because it's exactly the same thing as my previous scenarios, with the exception that it's run as a middleware and not as a controller. So we first had a look at the size impact of the different image types. This leaves us with some margin to play around with and first reduce our image to an acceptable size. Next, we looked at the client-side solution to handle multiple versions of an image. We first looked at a responsive solution. It is using an image tag, it doesn't require scripting, and it does support mobile. However, all images are loaded all the time, so it makes it worse. Then we looked at the picture media tag. However, it does not use an image tag. It requires us to define different image sources inside its tag. It does not require scripting, and it is supported on mobile. In the next version, we looked at the data attribute. It does use the image tag, but it also requires scripting, and it is supported on mobile. And finally, we looked at the srcset attribute. It does use the image tag. It doesn't require scripting, but it doesn't work on mobile devices. So in the client-only side solutions, for me, the picture media version works best. Next, we tried a server-only version. By using an image controller, client-side, we could use an image tag. We tried to detect the client by using a user agent, but that's quite error-prone, especially for tablets. For desktop versions, this doesn't really allow us to resize an image after load. The server-only version doesn't really seem a feasible solution. Next, we looked at a mixed mode. We tried a multitude of image controllers with image tags and/or in combination with image and scripts, which allows us to receive the more or less wanted result. Images changed on the fly, are server handled, and are supported on mobile devices, but scripts are required. The picture version doesn't use the image tag, but is supported on mobile devices and doesn't require scripts. So in the mixed mode, the best solution for me would be the picture media version in combination with an image controller. And finally, we had a look at the middleware version. If you're serious about the server route, then this is the way to go rather than a simple image controller. The server route only makes sense if you have a more complex logic, like requiring access to a database, security, or other complex logic. You can find the source code on GitHub in the link below. If you guys enjoyed this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.